Hi everyone, I'm Mike Mintz. I'm a freelance software developer who has fallen in love with ReaktRethinkDB over the past year. I'm super excited to be here tonight presenting to all of you, and I'm going to be talking about an open source project that I've been working on called React-RethinkDB. React-RethinkDB is a JavaScript library that you can plug into any React application to give your React components the ability to directly subscribe to RethinkDB queries, have the results come in real time, and automatically re-render on the fly as things change. For those of you that don't know what React is a JavaScript library for building front-end interactive user interfaces, both in the browser and recently on mobile with React Native. For those of you that don't know what JavaScript is, good luck understanding my talk. It's not going to make any sense, but hopefully you'll be able to glean something out of it. So in this talk, I'm going to give a brief high-level overview of how React-RethinkDB works, what happens in the front end, what happens in the back end, and then we're going to jump into a code demo where we take an existing React application that's front-end only and integrate it with RethinkDB in the back end as the data layer. Feel free to interrupt me at any point with questions if you have trouble understanding. If I go too fast or anything, just let me know and I'll slow down and explain something. And we can also take questions at the end. So let's get started. Can you all see this? This is a flowchart of how React-RethinkDB works at a high level. Starting on the left side, you have what goes on in the browser, and on the right side, you have what goes on the back end in the server. A React developer builds a React component. In this case, let's call it the Whiteboard component. That's what we'll be building later on in the talk. And they need to define two methods, an observe method, where they define a list of all of the ReQL queries, that stands for RethinkDB query language, all of the ReQL queries that they want to subscribe to real-time results for. And you also need to define a render method in your React component where you explain how the React component should be displayed with HTML DOM. All React components have to define a render method, but what goes on when you're using React-RethinkDB is that you have access to the results of all of your ReQL queries in the render method, and this will be in a variable called data, which you'll see in the demo. So React-RethinkDB, that's the JavaScript library that runs on top of that React component that gets mixed in. And React-RethinkDB is a wrapper around RethinkDB WebSocket client, which is another library I've written. And you can use RethinkDB WebSocket client with any JavaScript framework. You don't have to use React-RethinkDB. React-RethinkDB just gives you the React idioms of one-way data binding and rendering and all that cool stuff that I love. But RethinkDB WebSocket client is just a very lightweight wrapper around the official JavaScript RethinkDB driver. The only difference being that we compile it with Webpack using a compiler plugin that polyfills all calls to net.connect, which would normally create a TCP socket, which is not supported in browsers, and replaces all of those calls with calls to new WebSocket, which is supported in browser and in Node.js, so that that data can be sent to the server over the WebSocket. Hopefully you're following me so far. On the server, we're running RethinkDB WebSocket Server, which is another library I've written, which runs on Node.js, listens for incoming WebSocket connections, and automatically forwards all of the packets on a TCP connection to RethinkDB itself. You can use anything on the server that listens for WebSocket connections, like WebSockify. But the nice thing about using RethinkDB WebSocket Server is that it allows the application developer to specify a query whitelist, which is a list of query patterns that are acceptable, that can actually get forwarded on, versus everything else will get rejected, so that you can make your application more secure. So that is how it works at a high level. I'm going to jump into a demo. If anyone has any questions, you can ask now, or we'll begin. So the demo, I have the code up on GitHub under React-RethinkDB Whiteboard demo. If any of you want to check it out and follow along, the link is also in the meetup description. I'm going to start from sort of the middle of the commit history of this project, where we already have a React application that is just front-end only for using a whiteboard. And I'll show you a demo of that right now. So this is what the application looks like. I'm going to use the Chrome React plugin to show you what the React components look like. Can you all see that? I'll make it a little bigger. Oh, that's pretty big. So I log in with my username, Mike, password, ABC123, and you see at the top we have an auth wrapper component that takes care of login. After I log in, there's a whiteboard list component that manages listing all of the whiteboards that we have in the application. Right now it just has a button which calls create board when you click on it. And when you click on it, I can specify a board name, I'll make another board, and that creates these spans, the list of the board right here. When you click on each board, that renders the board itself under a whiteboard component. And if you look at that component, it's just a SVG, which is the element that allows you to draw lines and shapes and stuff. So here we have a list of lines inside of each board. So when you mouse down on the SVG element, it lets you draw a line, and when you click on any line, it deletes that line. So that's the application at a high level. 3 components, auth wrapper on top, whiteboard list below that, and whiteboard below that. I'm going to go briefly into the code to show you what that looks like. On the back end, we just have one file, index.js. Can everyone read this? What's increase the font size? Okay. How about this? More? All right, I'll go a little bigger. Okay, so this is the back end as it stands right now. All it does, it's a Node.js Express server that just listens on port 8015 and serves files out of the assets directory. And in the assets directory, we just have 2 files, index.html, which is mostly blank, except it has a div with ID container, where React is going to render all of its components. And it loads a script called bundle.js, which is also in the assets directory here. Bundle.js is generated dynamically with Babel and Webpack. These are 2 tools in the JavaScript ecosystem that are used to take modern JavaScript using things like fat arrow syntax and class syntax, as well as JSX syntax, which lets you put HTML in your React components. It takes all of that stuff that browsers don't understand today, compiles that to one file that browsers do understand. And the files that we have as our source files are in the client directory here. Our entry point is app.jsx. All we do is we look for the div with ID container here and call react-dom.render on that and render our top-level component, auth wrapper. And then we have the 3 components here, auth wrapper, whiteboard list, and whiteboard. I'm not going to show you those now since it would take a long time to go through all the code there. But as we start to integrate ReThinkDB into the back end, it'll be more clear how those work. So that being said, let's integrate ReThinkDB into the back end and get this to run. The first thing we need to do is create some tables. I've already done that in the ReThinkDB admin tool. So you can see in the test database here, we have 3 tables that are blank. The users table, the boards table, because we'll have a separate object for every board, and the lines table, and each line is going to ultimately refer to a board ID. So going back to the app, the first thing we need to do is install some dependencies. So we're going to install on the front end react-rethinkdb, and on the back end we need rethinkdb WebSocket server. And while that's installing, we're going to go to the back end and import the listen function from rethinkdb WebSocket server. And we're going to call listen to listen for incoming WebSocket connections with some options. We need to specify the HTTP server so that we bind to the Express server, the path that we want to listen on, which is going to be /API, the database host that we'll be proxying all of our queries to, which is localhost. It's running on my laptop, as well as the port. And then this special parameter called unsafely allow any query. And we're going to set that to true. This is not safe. This is not secure. You should never set this to true in a production environment. But this is really nice for front-end development because we're now done with the back end. We don't have to do anything more with this file because any query we write on the front end will get executed and submitted to ReThinkDB. But when we come back and lock down this application, we're going to have to remember to set this to false so that we don't have this big security hole. Okay, so that's the back end. In the front end, we start with our highest level component, auth wrapper, and we need to connect to the backend over that WebSocket connection. So we go to auth wrapper. We're going to import react-rethinkdb. Nope. And we're going to define a connect method, which will take a username and a password, which we're going to use later when we do some query security. But for the time being, all we need is the path that we're connecting to, which is /API, and we call rethinkdb.defaultSession.connect with some options. Default session refers to the one WebSocket connection that we're going to share across our entire React application as a singleton. You can also create your own sessions and have multiple ones when you're making universal code in the backend, but this is simpler because we don't have to pass around a bunch of things back and forth. So we need to specify some parameters here. We need the host. It's running on my laptop. We're listing for WebSocket connections on port 8015. The path is /API, and the database name that we're going to be using is test. So we've defined connect. We need to now call connect at the end of login with the username and the password. And we need to disconnect when we log out. So we'll call react-rethinkdb default session.close after we log out. We also want to make sure that when we first load the page, when this component first mounts, we also attempt to connect if we have a username stored in local storage. So let's do that here. And this way, when a user refreshes the page and they're already logged in, they don't have to log in again because it'll happen automatically. So that's the auth wrapper component. Let's go on to the next component, which is whiteboard list. We have to do the same import at the top, react-rethinkdb. We're also going to set r equal to react-rethinkdb.r to allow us to do ReQL queries more concisely. We need to mix in the react-rethinkdb mixin, the default mixin, which uses the default session. And as we went over in the slides, we have to define an observe function. This function takes props and state, which is the React way of passing data around. We're not going to be using that here, though. And we are going to return a list of queries. So we're going to have one query called boards, and we're going to make a new query request. And the query that we want to send to the server is r.table boards. We want to subscribe to changes, and we want to set the initial value to the empty array so that before we get a result from the server, we want to be rendering empty results, not undefined. So we've defined the observe function. Now we need to go down into our render function and actually use the value from the query. So instead of using this.state.boards, which comes from our local in-memory state in React, we are going to be using this.data.boards.value, which is what the mixin provides in our render function, the result from that query, which will be the empty list initially, and then will be populated with the results from the server. Since we're no longer using React state to be storing all of this data, we can delete that from here. And we can also, when we go down here to render the whiteboard component, we don't need to pass it lines anymore because it's going to do its own query subscription to get lines. And we don't need to pass it the onCreate and onDelete handler because those are going to happen with their own queries. So we'll delete that. One last thing in this component is when we create a board, instead of calling this.setState, which modifies the local state in React and concatenates a board to the end of that, we're just going to call rethinkdb default session.run query, and we can run any ReQL here. We're going to do r.tableboards.insertBoard. So this board that we just constructed here gets into the database. We don't have to set the ID to a random string anymore because rethinkdb takes care of setting a random UUID whenever you insert something here. Okay, so this component is done. The last component we have is the whiteboard component, and it's going to look pretty similar. So I'm going to copy and paste the imports at the top. I'm going to copy and paste the mixin at the top. I'm going to copy and paste the observe function at the top. And instead of observing for a list of boards, we're going to observe for a list of all the lines, but not all the lines because we just want the lines that have the board ID that we currently have selected, which comes out of props. We've defined the observe function. Now we need to go to the render function and make sure we're using the results properly. So instead of this.props.lines, we'll be doing this.data.lines.value. And when we issue our callbacks to create line here, And to delete line here, we need to do that with ReQL queries. So let's change this to react-rethinkdb default session.run query r.table lines.insert line. And let's delete that ID, because we don't need that anymore. And the same thing when we delete lines, we'll do react-rethinkdb.default session.run query r.table lines.get line.id.delete. OK, now we try running it again and hope that there's no errors. So far, so good. Yep. OK, so let's try this out. I'm going to open up, make this a little smaller here. Open up, log out, and refresh the page. Log in as Mike ABC123. And you can see in the query log down here, we have a connect coming from localhost, and we have a query, r.tableBoards, with .changes because we selected changes equals true, and the DB is set to test because we specified that when we connected. And this query is allowed because we set unsafely allow any query to true. I'm going to load a new browser on the right side, so we can do this side by side. Log in as Mike2. And if I create a board, board 1, board 2, it shows up over here. If I click on that board and start drawing, they show up. I have a different color for every username to make it easy to tell which line corresponds to which user. And if you click on lines, they get deleted. So with just a few lines of code, we have integrated our existing React front end with ReThinkDB in the back end. And I think that's pretty cool. This is completely insecure, so the next step is we need to go ahead and validate these queries and make sure that no attacker can come in and do random things like db drop and get the password of user, stuff like that. So let's see how that works in practice. So the first thing we need to do is go to our backend, index.js, and change unsafely allow any query to false. I'm also going to go to auth wrapper in the front end, and where we connect to /API as our path, I'm going to include the credentials here so that we know which username and login are being attempted to log in right now. And I will recompile and restart. And refresh. And now you don't see any boards at the top of the page where we used to see boards. And if you look at our query log, that same query we issued has a deny next to it. So no query is going to be getting results here. This is good because our app is now secure. This is bad because our app is now useless. So let's go and try and get the best of both worlds by making our app useful. So let's go back to the backend, index.js, and we're going to define in options for ReThinkDB WebSocket server a query whitelist, which is going to be equal to an array of queries. And we can copy and paste this query straight into here. And if I restart the backend, I don't have to recompile the front end anymore. It's going to complain because I forgot to import R. But otherwise, I think it'll work. If I restart, we get our list of boards at the top, and here at the query log, you can see it was allowed. The next step is if you click on a board, you should see a list of lines that was denied as well. So let's copy and paste this query into our query whitelist. And I'll make this query a little bit easier to read. And we will refresh the page. Click on the board, and you now see some lines. This query was accepted. But if you go to the other board, it doesn't work. And if you looked closely at the query, it actually had a hard-coded board ID here. And this is not a scalable solution in practice because you can't be writing a new whitelist entry for every single possible dynamically generated query in your backend. So instead of that, what we have is a solution called ReQL pattern. So I call ReQL pattern rp.check. And this takes a function from the placeholder, whatever the value was of that part of the query, we'll call it x, to a Boolean, and we want to make sure that that x is a string. I'm fine with any value that someone puts in this query as long as it's a string, because this is a read-only query. As long as this thing is not an object like r.insert or r.delete, it should be fine. And I also need to import RP at the top for a ReQL pattern. So if I restart the backend and refresh the page, I can now list either board. There's no lines on this board, but you can trust me that if there were, that would work. Or if you don't trust me, we can set unsafely allow any query just to confirm that I didn't break something. Refresh, draw some lines over here, set it back to false, and restart. And make sure. OK, so that query works. Next query is create board. We'll create board 3. That failed as well, so I'll copy and paste that. And similarly, we are going to be, let's make this a little easier to read. We'll be doing ReQL pattern.check. We'll make sure that it's a string, that name of the board. We'll also make sure that that name of the board is not just white space, so that it has length greater than 0 after trimming the white space. If we restart the server, refresh the page, and create a board, board 3, that gets accepted, but space, 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 space gets rejected. Cool. So we can now create boards, and we can list boards. We can list lines, but we can't create lines, so we'll copy and paste that one in here. This one's a bit more complicated than the others because it has a lot of things going on in the query. We have all the coordinates for the line, the username that inserted the line, the board ID that corresponds to that line. I guess it's not that much stuff, but it's a little. I don't know why it's doing, oh, I see. OK, so in each of these places, we could add a placeholder. We could use rp.check. Instead, we'll use ReQL pattern.ref to store a reference to this so that we can validate them all at once. So we'll be storing username. And then for each of these things, we'll do p.ref for x1, y1, x2, and y2. And at the end of this, we can call .validate. And this allows us to take a function that returns true or false based on whether this query was allowed. And that function takes refs and session as arguments. And refs right here refers to all of the references that we stored for placeholders in the query. So we'll first extract all of those placeholders, board ID, username, x1, y1, x2, y2. And we'll make a function to check each of those coordinates that takes a coordinate, checks that that is a number, that it's greater or equal than 0 and less or equal than 300, because those are our SVG bounds. And we'll check x1, check x2, check y1, check y2. It's probably a better way to do this, but this works. And if all those are good, we'll return true. Otherwise, we return false. And to make this confirm that it's working, we'll set 300 to 150 for now so that it only accepts queries in the top left corner. Refresh. So I can draw lines up here, but over here, they're getting denied. So that worked. We check the coordinates. Now we also need to check the board ID and the username. The username is easy. We'll check that the username that was passed in is equal to the session.username, which they logged in with at the beginning. We haven't actually defined a session yet, so I'll get back to that after I finish this query. And finally, we want to check that the board ID that they included with that line actually corresponds to an existing board. So we will run a query, and we'll do r.table boards.get that board ID and make sure it's not equal to null. And that returns a promise of a Boolean, and whatever that resolves to, if it's true, this query will be accepted. Otherwise, it will be rejected. We haven't actually defined a run query method in this backend because it's just a Node.js server right now. So we'll go connect. We'll make a connection promise to our backend ReaktRethinkDB server with host localhost port 28015. This is different from the connection that we have for our WebSocket connections that are being proxied to ReaktRethinkDB. This is just for the purpose of query validations. And we'll make a run query method that takes a query, resolves the connection promise, and runs that query on that promise. We also need to define our session. So we'll say we have a session creator. Spell that right. And this is a function that takes the query parameters that are passed in the WebSocket construction from the front end and returns a session object. So we'll get the username and password out of the query params, create a session, which will just be the username, an object that has the username rather, and we can return a promise that resolves to that session. So now we can keep track of the username over the course of all of the queries that are submitted over that WebSocket, and let's make sure we remember to check the password. We'll come back to that in a second, but let's make sure that we can create lines again. Here, that works. So to check the password, we need to issue a query against the users table. So we're going to run a query on r.tableusers.getUsername, which is our ID for the user table. And that returns a promise of a user. We'll chain that. And if the user exists, we'll do something. If it doesn't, we'll do something else. So if the user exists, let's return whether the user.password is equal to the password that was passed in. We'll return that session. Promise dot, we can just do session here. Otherwise, we need to reject that entire session, say forbidden. And if the user does not exist, let's create the user. So we'll make an insert query, r.tableusers.insert. The ID will be set to the username, and the password will be set to the password. And we will run that insert query and chain that to return the session. So we've done this. We don't need to return that. Restart. And let's log out. Log in as Mike. We've now created the Mike account. That seems to have worked. Log out, log in as Mike again. We've now logged in and checked the password for the Mike account. That's worked. Let's log in as Mike one last time, but with the wrong password. And you don't get any boards up here at the top. And as you see below, there's an error in the session creator, forbidden. So we've successfully prevented the user from logging in without their username. OK, so let's log in with the correct username and password. We've successfully been able to list boards so far, create boards, list lines, create lines. Our final step is being able to delete lines when you click on it. So we'll copy and paste that query to the query whitelist at the very bottom. And we'll call .validate on that. That'll take refs and session. And we'll make sure to generalize this part of the query, rp.ref. This is the line ID. And we'll say, run a query against the database on the lines table. Get that line ID. And make sure that the, this is a .get, that the username field is equal to the session.username. So this will return a promise of a Boolean that confirms that if you delete a line, that line better have the same username as the username you logged in as. In other words, you can only delete lines that you draw. So we have a little bit of security going on in this application to demonstrate how that works. So now when I delete a line, I can delete the blue ones, but I cannot delete the red ones. So that's all we had to do to secure the application. Copy and paste the queries from the query log into the query whitelist and generalize the parts of the queries that were dynamically generated and add some validation logic. In an actual production application, you'd want to also use secure WebSockets with SSL certificates. You'd want to be hashing your password with bcrypt. But all of this is possible with Node.js on the back end, just adding more to your server. So yeah, thank you guys for letting me talk about this tonight. If you have any questions, feel free to ask right now. But that's all I got.